Hi guys, welcome. My name is Zach.
And my name is Amanda, and we are the co-presidents of the Yale School of Management Energy Club.
We are so excited to welcome you to today's event, which is a conversation with Christiana Figueres. This event is being co-sponsored by the Center for Business and Environment, We at Yale, which is a collaborative movement to support women innovators and entrepreneurs across Yale's campus, and the SOM Energy Club. And we want to thank everyone who's put in their time and effort into making today's event happen. I likely don't have to tell many of you here or watching who Christiana Figueres is, but she is a world authority on global climate change and was the executive secretary of the UNFCCC from 2010 to 2016. Ms. Figueres is a founding partner of Global Optimism and is currently the vice chair of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, a senior fellow for Conservation International, board member at the World Resources Institute and Acciona, and convener of Mission 2020, a global effort to peak greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020. During her tenure at the UNFCCC, Ms. Figueres brought together national and subnational governments, corporations and activists, financial institutions and communities of faith, think tanks and technology providers, NGOs and parliamentarians to jointly deliver the historic Paris Agreement on climate change, in which 195 sovereign nations agreed on a collaborative path forward to limit future global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. For this achievement, Ms. Figueres, well below, yes. Yes. Absolutely. For this achievement, Ms. Figueres has been credited with forging a new brand of collaborative diplomacy. In addition to her remarkable diplomatic achievements over the past 20 years, she's also served as the director of Renewable Energy in the Americas, and in 1995 founded the nonprofit Center for Sustainable Development of the Americas.
Would also like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Angel Hsu. Dr. Hsu received her PhD from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and is a professor at Yale and US College and an adjunct professor here at Yale FES. Her research focuses on data-driven approaches to inform environmental decision-making and policy. Dr. Hsu's work as the director of the Yale Data-Driven Environmental Solutions Group contributed to research underpinning the Mission 2020 report that Ms. Figueres convened. We'll start off this event with opening comments from Ms. Figueres, followed by a conversation between Ms. Figueres and Dr. Hsu, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A session at the end featuring topics submitted in advance as well as live audience Q&A. Please note that this event is being live streamed through CBay. And with that, please join us in welcoming Christiana Figueres to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. And you know, the first thing that I would like to celebrate this morning is that we're working and eating at the same time. I lived in this wonderful country for 20 years. I'm not a US citizen, but I did live here for 20 years. And now I live in Europe, and I have to tell you, eating and working is not the thing that Brits do, which is where I live now. And I also spend a lot of time working in Spain. That's the other extreme, right? You take a break. In the middle of the most, ravishing discussion, you stop. You go for lunch. It takes 2 hours. Then you have to take 1 hour after that. 3 hours later, it's like, what were we discussing this morning? So it's so nice to be back here and be very time efficient, multitasking, getting many things done at the same time. I feel so much happier and so much at home here. So that's the first thing I want to celebrate. And the second thing that I want to celebrate is I just asked Gihanna, my daughter, when I walked into this room, I'm like, this is exactly the room where I was. When was that? So she told me it was April 2016. She came with me, and it was that visit that decided her that she wanted to come to Yale. She has since been collecting master's degrees at Yale. So, Gihanna, through you, I'm also a Yalie. So, let's see, where do we start? I actually need a piece of paper. Can I just take this? I wanted to start with science because in the best of all cases, and certainly in the case of climate change, policy needs to be science-based. Certainly when it comes to the response to climate change. And so I have many wonderful climate change scientists, but I have one in particular who is now my favorite because he speaks English, meaning he actually speaks an understandable language. And he has explained the urgency of climate change with a very, very simple piece of paper. And that is that we know now through science that we have very two short years. 2020 is the last moment that we have as humanity to actually put ourselves in the position of being able to bend the curve of emissions and start going down in order to get to zero net by 2050. The way that Johan explains this, and I now feel scientifically authorized to do the same thing, is that we have, let's assume that this is more or less 40, we're actually emitting 41 gigatons per year, but let's say that this is 40. Well, by 2020, here's where we need to be. We need to be in a position to say, right, as of 2020, by 2030, 1 decade later, we will be at 1/2 of that, at 20 gigatons. 10 years later, we will be at 10. So where are we? What year are we in now? 2040. 10 years after that, 2050, we will be at 5 gigatons. That is the rate of emission reduction that we have to follow according to science, and not only in order to stand the minimum chance, the minimum safe moral chance of keeping emissions well below 2 and striving to 1.5. But it's not just defined by science, it's also the safe route of emission reductions from an economic point of view. Because if we don't do that, we would have to cut out so many current assets, high carbon assets, that we would not be able to have a smooth transition. So think of this rate as a smooth curve that takes us from 40 all the way down to 5 gigatons by 2050, which should be able by then to be naturally absorbed by the planet. That gives us a zero net. So a big task from where we are right now at 41 gigatons and growing, a huge task to actually reverse the trend in 2 short years. However, because we knew that that was the case, and because we knew that the first trench, if you will, of national efforts under the Paris Agreement were far away from that. In the Paris Agreement, there is baked in what we call the ratchet mechanism, or you can call it the ambition increase mechanism, which is that every 5 years, because if you wait for 10, it may be too late, every 5 years, we have the coming together of countries again who are going to say, right, this is how much we put into the Paris Agreement, this was our so-called nationally determined contribution, but because technology has advanced, and it's advancing very quickly, because finance has shifted, and it is shifting increasingly quickly, and because policies are beginning to have effect, now we can actually increase our ambition. And so that is already baked into the Paris Agreement on a 5-yearly cycle. So in Yale, as well as in my home country, Costa Rica, 2015, which is when the Paris Agreement was adopted, plus 5, is 2020. So you see that policy and science actually converge on the starting point of 2020, both because of science for the bending the curve, but also from a global policy point of view, because it is the first time that this ratchet mechanism is actually going to be implemented. Some people say it is the first time it's going to be questioned. I refuse to say that. It is going to be implemented because we don't have another option, and we will talk about that later. But so just put into your, if you're following climate, just put into your, set your alarm clock for every 5 years, okay? So 2020 first time, 2025, 2030, 2035, etc. All the way every 5 years, we need countries to come together and increase their ambition. This year, we will have an extremely important report coming out from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which a report commissioned by the countries together in 2015. And it is a report that is going to give us an assessment of how far off or how near are we to getting to the desired 1.5 degrees maximum temperature increase. Well, sneak preview, the report is going to say at the current pace of emission reductions, we will have exhausted the entire carbon budget for the rest of mankind's existence on this planet. It's not a carbon budget for my lifetime or for yours or for your grandchildren. It is the carbon budget for the rest of the existence of mankind on this planet, as long as we want to stay here. If you're all already planning to leave for Mars or Venus, fine. But for those of us who are staying here, that is the carbon budget, and we will exhaust that carbon budget by 2040 if we continue on the emissions path that we are. So you see the importance of actually quite dramatic emission reductions. So that's the science upon which the Paris Agreement is actually anchored. Now, let's move over and say, okay, that's the science, got it, pretty daunting. Now, what about policy/politics? Or economy, actually. That is a much more complicated scenario. To those who say, well, climate science is not really clear and there are all these uncertainties and da-da-da-da-da-da, fine. Look at politics and tell me if that doesn't have any more uncertainties than science does. So if you look at policy and if you look at the economy, the moving forward of the economy, you actually have today what I call a bifurcated reality, okay? A bifurcated reality because over here in the left-hand corner, you have what I call the unreal politics, which is what you're seeing in the international negotiations. To those of you who are following the lead up to this COP in Poland this year, you will see that there is an enormous drawback or pullback from developing countries led by China and India, who are frankly sitting there over in this corner and going, you have got to be kidding. The United States said what? Well, in that case, we are not going to agree to what we need to agree this year. Understandable, right? Totally understandable. And so at the international level, there is what would seem to some seeing it from the outside as though a denial of the Paris Agreement. Nobody wants to implement it anymore. Oh my God, danger, 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 right? Alarm bells going off. Well, the fun thing is, and why I call that, a very unreal politics is because on the one hand, that is what they're saying at the international level. On the other hand, you have things like India just decided to prove its point, that it's going to donate $1 million to put solar panels on the UN building in New York. Why? Because that is their concrete response to the attack on multilateralism, to the attack on the Paris Agreement. They're like, oh, really? Well, we're going to show you. India, okay? This is not Norway giving $1 million. No, this is India, okay, giving a donation to put solar panels on the United Nations. Really quite interesting response in politics. That doesn't have anything to do with their emission reductions. That's just a political response. Here is where the lines are not going to be crossed. And interestingly enough, when you look inside domestically, there you see the real economy actually taking place, which has very little to do with the other side of the bifurcated reality, the international negotiations. Domestically, you see China cleaning up its act, closing coal plants, putting in more and more. They are investing over $300 billion into renewable energy, not because they want to save the planet, let's be very clear, but because they're interested in those 13 million jobs that are going to be created through that investment. Furthermore, they're interested in continuing to be the export nation of the world. And they know that moving in very quickly into 5 or 10 years, products and services that are going to be on demand across the globe are going to have to be low carbon. So of course, they want to be there. India, moving forward, saying, you know what? We also have the bad habit of wanting to breathe, right? China also, the Chinese actually want to breathe. Indians want to breathe. I mean, I have no idea where they have that habit. But the point is, they want to breathe clean air. And that is why they're closing coal. That is why they're setting dates for the banning of the internal combustion engine in vehicles, because they are so much more concerned about their reality right now, independently of whatever the dark house, which used to have some lights on, and hence was called the White House, the dark house, independently of dark house, they're actually moving forward domestically. China and India have already today, in the year 2018, they have already complied with their first tranche of the Paris Agreement, and they are well beyond that. So why are they being obstreperous in the international negotiations? Because of the dark house. It doesn't have anything to do with the reality that they have domestically. So a very, very bifurcated reality. In fact, I would actually even extend the bifurcation of reality to the United States. Because despite the dark house, you all know that cities, states, corporations in the United States, equaling more or less 50% of the economy of the United States, continue to move forward and decarbonize because it's good for their economy or their bottom line. And I hope you all heard that Exxon and Chevron have actually agreed to join OGCI, which is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, a previously group of 11, now 13 companies that are actually committed to working on climate change, not with the speed that we want, but hey, that's a signal. That is a very interesting political signal that Exxon and Chevron, who have been, the laggards, are actually now joining the leaders in the field. So again, a bifurcated reality. Both realities are equally real. Both of them have their effects. Both of them have both political and economic effects. And both of them are sending messages out to the world. So we need to choose which reality do we actually want to take more seriously, and in particular, which reality do we want to support and accelerate. That is a choice that we have to make. Last week, we were in California at the Global Climate Action Summit, and we just saw the most astonishing display of decarbonization taking place across corporations, across cities, across businesses. Now we have over 500 businesses that have actually taken on what we call science-based targets, which is zero net emissions by 2050. We had philanthropy come in and for the first time commit to $4 billion going into climate change. We had over 300 investors managing assets of over 32 trillion say they are actually moving their investments over to green finance. We had an amazing tech initiative with 21 companies in the tech sector saying, not only have we reduced already our emissions, but we're going to be working with our supply chains, and we're going to be devoting our products and services to help the entire economy, because tech, if you haven't noticed, infuses everything in the economy. And if you have that tech devoted to reducing emissions, well, then you have a very powerful lever. So an amazing display in California, but it doesn't even speak to what is actually the potential, the global potential. Fascinating report that came out just a few days before the California meeting, where we had for the first time the most updated results of what would it mean if we decarbonize in time. What would it mean? So, contrary to those that say, oh my God, catastrophe, right? If we decarbonize, we're going to be going back, 300 years to the Middle Ages. No. If we decarbonize in time, and time is precious, if we decarbonize in time, we would get $26 trillion in economic benefits, mostly reaped by the private sector. Interesting. We would generate 65 million new low-carbon jobs. To those of you who are concerned about, am I going to have a job, or is the robot going to take the job before I do, or any other kind of artificial intelligence? Not so. Because low-carbon economy is a completely new sector, there are many jobs that are being created for humans, in addition to for machines. For those who are concerned about health, we will be avoiding 700,000 premature deaths. Can you believe that in the year 2018, we still have 700,000 people who are dying every year because of air pollution? Frankly, that is absolutely unacceptable. That is immoral, that is unacceptable, and that has to be changed. And that can be changed substantially through the eradication of fossil fuel emissions. And to those who would like to protect the interests of governments, because they also have to do their job, a decent price on carbon, whether it's through taxes or through a price in a trading system, would generate $2.8 trillion in government revenues. So what is there not to like about this? Honestly, right? We're being presented with one scenario, which is, frankly, all the doom and gloom that you've heard about climate, multiplied times 10, okay? Because we are about to cross thresholds that are irreversible. That's one scenario. Or we can be co-creators of a completely different world. And we can do it. We have all the technology, we have the capital, we have we have the know-how. We just have to put all of this together. It's just, duh. So the question, however, is, what is it going to take? What's in the duh? Okay? What's in the duh? Because clearly, if we haven't done it before, it's because there's something there. I would like to pose to you that what is holding us back is this mindset that we have, that I have, that I think some people in the audience, because they're in my generation, have, but I certainly hope that you do not, most of you. The mindset that progress can only be linear. Now, to those of you who are either working in or close to anything in the tech sector, you know that that concept is very 5 minutes ago. You know that in the tech sector, exponential is the name of the game. And if you're not doing things exponentially, you're out, you're broke, because that is the path that the entire tech sector is on. And so if the tech sector has been proving that for years and years and years, Moore's law to begin with, why is all the rest of the sectors, why are they not doing that also? And furthermore, which are the sectors that are already beginning to give some sign that they're on an exponential curve? Renewable energy, beginning to give the sign that they're on an exponential curve. 10 years ago, you said solar energy, people would think, yeah, right, one solar panel somewhere, fine. Well, renewable energy is growing across the world, doubling every 4 years. We went from basically 0 to 5%. We're at 12%. At that rate of exponential growth, we will easily be at 50% renewable energy by 2030. Easily. 50% of the entire electricity of the world will be produced by the family of renewable energies. They are definitely on the exponential curve. EVs, the story of the year, right? How cool is it that every single vehicle company is actually already has announced that they are moving over to EVs. Most large cities of the world have already set a date by which they will ban the sale of all vehicles that are not electric vehicles. How cool is that? You have some countries, in fact, 8 countries, that have already either set that date as early as 2025 for Norway or as late for 2040, but an increasing number of countries that are setting dates for banning any vehicle that has the internal combustion engine. I would hereby like to welcome you all to the inauguration of the Museum to the Internal Combustion Engine. Goodbye, internal combustion engine. Thank you very much, right? Honestly, we have, and the reason why there should be a museum is because that technology was incredible last century. It got us a lot of this, right? A lot of this which is not present in every country in the world, but in some. So thank you to the fossil fuels. Thank you to the internal combustion engine. Did a great job last century, just like any other little old lady. Time to retire you with honor. Goodbye. Okay? Goodbye. And in finance, the same story, right? In finance, the same story. We know that we need at least $1 trillion invested in the green economy per year in order to be on track. But just to take one financial instrument, green bonds, 10 years ago, wasn't even a concept. And in 10 years, we have gone from 0 to 40 to 80 to 150 to 250. At that exponential curve, we will easily be at $1 trillion just with green bonds by 2021. So we're beginning to see in some sectors that there is a hockey stick. That hockey stick that the IT sector has seen and has experienced, and that they are now turning their power of exponentializing, if that is a word, and otherwise we have just created it, exponentializing all of the other sectors to be able to decarbonize at that rate. Well, that's going to make it possible for us to aspire to decarbonize at the rates in which we must. So Finally, I just wanted to add, what can you do about this, right? Well, if you work for a tech sector, excellent. Ask them about the tech sector initiative. But here's the interesting thing that I have been hearing from most corporate leaders with whom I spend a lot of time. Most corporate leaders have actually gotten it. They got it, that they are in a completely transformed risk and reward context. Completely transformed. It has basically been turned upside down. They used to think that high carbon, because they even didn't think about high carbon, was actually the safe bet. They now know that it is becoming very quickly the highest risk to their business continuity. For three amazing reasons. The first, they have gotten the message that if they do not integrate all the aspects of environmental, social, and governance, ESG, for which I use carbon reductions only as the proxy, but you know that once you reduce carbon, you're actually bringing in most of the other ESGs, not automatically, but it starts you on that path. Corporates that do not integrate into their main business, not on page 79 of their annual report, this is what we did for our community. No, it's about integrated it into your strategy, into your corporate strategy. It's not to be appeared, at the end of the report. It is what you are there for. A corporation, a company with a very, very clear purpose is the only company that is actually going to survive. And they have understood that because their investors are actually asking them for that. And so if you do not turn yourself to be a company with a purpose that is actually achieved, it's not enough to just have the purpose and not achieve it. You gotta achieve it too. Well, investors will not invest in you. If you are not a responsible company in this 21st century, no one will invest in your company. They're beginning to get that message. Second reason that they're actually beginning to get the message. If you do not produce products and services that are responsible with people and planet, guess what? No one is going to buy from you, because the route to purchase has fundamentally changed. You don't walk down the street and go into the store. I mean, sometimes, but not usually, right? Usually it's like all online purchasing with the power of filter. So now, all of you who use Uber, you know that you can go in and go like, okay, I want an EV, right? Now multiply that. Can you imagine, and we're very, very close to it, when you go on Amazon, you will actually filter your Amazon account to say, I only want, when I search for whatever gadget I'm searching for, I only want to be shown those companies that are actually responsible companies with people and planet. And otherwise, don't even offer it to me. That is about to happen. So when that route to purchase is there, now you see the companies are like, oh, wait, I want to be up there. The route to purchase has changed. And it's technology that is allowing for that, right? So increasingly, we will not want to buy from irresponsible companies. And finally, the third message why the economy is radically changing is because if you're not a responsible company with people, planet, and profit, nobody will want to work for you. And that is the power that you and your, older generation, that is the power that the new generation has in your hands. That is your power. Do not sell your brains to companies that are not responsible. What for? It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your brains. You should be working with, and certainly for, if you have to work for, I would suggest you work with, but if you're going to work for, then only with companies that are responsible. They're the ones that not only deserve, but need your talent in order to get us to where we need to go. And because of those three lessons, and I can't tell you how many CEOs tell me like, Christiana, you know what? We're having such a difficult time because we don't get the kind of talent applying to our jobs. I'm like, well, I wonder why. Why do you think Unilever gets, for every job that they announce, they get 1,400 applications? Because it's a responsible company. Hello? Right? I mean, it is so impressive, the fact that we are on the verge of the greatest transformation that humanity has ever set itself. We never, as a collective wisdom, as a collective people, all of humanity, we never have decided before, out of choice, out of intentionality, we are going to recreate the economy. We're going to recreate the world. This is the first time. You guys are incredibly privileged. So are we, the oldies, because we will at least witness it. You will do it. You will co-create it. And you know what? Say thank you for that incredible opportunity and do it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Christiana, for those really inspiring words and giving us a reminder of why we're all scholars and students studying so hard and working so hard to be part of the solutions that you mentioned. And I'm so glad that you started off speaking about science and the role that science has to play in helping us to understand where we're at and where we need to go, because clearly there's a huge gap, as the science suggests, between where we're headed in terms of current policies and what the science tells us we need to get to in order to reach this goal as well below 2 degrees.
Hold on, Angel. There is a gap only if you understand the reality to be static.
Exactly.
If you understand reality to be static, you are in big trouble, because yes, there is a big gap. But if you understand that every day we are creating reality, and that every time we are more and more aligned,
Right.
then you don't lose your heart palpitations about that.
And I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about is most of the climate models have shown that we have, in order to get to that 1.5 degree target, we have to go negative. And so you talked a lot about zero and net zero. But how do we get to that next step and go even deeper and increase the ambition, as you say, to get to those negative emissions, which most climate models say we absolutely have to introduce either carbon removal, carbon capture, sequestration, investing more in our agriculture and land in order to really get those deep negative emissions. So I'm wondering, what are some of the political barriers or some of the challenges that face that particular technology today?
So I know that there are many enthusiasts about carbon capture and storage, or use and storage. And certainly we will have to go into absorption or negative emissions. Now, we have 8 carbon capture and storage projects around the world. In order to do what we have to do, we have to get to 80. In 2 years. And currently, the cost of that technology is at $100 a ton. Mm-hmm. Where is the price of carbon? $5 a ton. I don't think we're going to do it with carbon capture. Yes, I think CCS or CCUS, geological, can be a very promising technology for the future. What it cannot be is the excuse to not reduce our emissions now. To say, okay, well, we're going to have this huge vacuum cleaner that is going to take everything out of, okay, maybe, but maybe not, and certainly not in time to bend the curve. So my answer to that is the other CCS technology, which is ages old, doesn't have any cost problems, doesn't have any safety issues, doesn't have to be invented, has been with us for thousands of years, and why the heck are we not applying it? And that is biological carbon capture and storage, right? So if we restore degraded lands, particularly on the continent of Africa, if we reforest deforested lands, reverse the trend of deforestation, if we turn over to sustainable agriculture, if we protect the very, very few still standing original forests that we have an enormous potential there to turn land area from being a source of emissions to being a sink. And we know how to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And it has all kinds of other benefits. It has the benefit of, it helps to stabilize aquifers, it helps to improve food security. By improving food and water security, it helps to minimize forced migration forced migration, because if I cannot produce on my land or in my neighboring land the food that I need for my children, of course I'm going to migrate.
Right.
I would prefer not to, but I would have to migrate. So it has so many other advantages, and it is one of my big frustrations, right? Because we know how to do this. Yes, of course, compared to the energy field, which is 70% of emissions, land use being only 30, but in the 70% of emissions, we kind of know how to do it better. The technology is there. It's more of a technical, fix, and the sources are more single point sources or large point sources, so that it's easier to do. On the other side, on land use, it is about cultural shifts.
Exactly.
And it's millions of people around all continents of the world with many different cultural traditions, with many different beliefs, very difficult to access. So that's why it is much more complicated. That is not an excuse for not doing it, because it is the safest carbon and capture and use and storage technology that we have.
And I'm so glad you brought up the cultural aspect. So we have a project here at Yale called the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and they've done a lot of research surveying people's attitudes and opinions about whether or not they think climate change will affect them or not. And what their latest data show is that people actually in the United States don't feel like climate change will affect them. And you brought up China and India and how people there, they want to breathe clean air, and that's a huge driving force for them to lobby their government to take action on climate change. So what are some of the strategies you think that we can...
So I think the clean air is actually a very interesting space, right? Because one of the problems about climate change is you can't see it.
Yes.
If I had a magic wand, what I would do is I would paint in phosphorescent something, pink, green something, every single molecule of CO2. Because if we could see the molecules, we would go like, oh my God, they're like popping up everywhere. But we can't see it, right? And so in the absence of that, we have to work through proxies. And the proxy is air pollution. Not all of it, but much of it comes from fossil fuels, either through burning coal for energy or through transport emissions, burning liquid fossil fuels, or through burning of land. But it's all, it all has certainly global warming effects, but it also has local pollution effects.
Right.
And so the fact that the United States, here's an interesting factoid. In the latest report on air pollution, where one is the worst country and 194 is the cleanest country, where do you think the United States comes out? 2, pretty demanding. 1 is the worst. Okay, good. Just checking. Who else wants to take a stab? Okay, it's number 6. Right between Bangladesh and Indonesia. Good job, US, right? So how is that possible that in a country like this, we don't have an absolutely ever-present moral outrage, public outrage about the fact that our children are breathing polluted air? This happens to be not a developing country. This happens to be not a poor country. And we're allowing our children to breathe polluted air, which means premature deaths. It means all kinds of air, of lung sicknesses. And by the way, it also means a decrease in your cognitive ability. So if you're at Yale, you probably weren't in those regions. But my point is, how is it possible that we do not have public outrage, absolute public outrage, certainly in all the developed countries, about the fact that we still have air pollution?
Right.
It's just unheard of.
Yeah, and the latest data show that it's not just a developing country problem. I mean, it absolutely affects 95% of people around the world are being exposed to unsafe air. So the fact that, there's very little action on addressing air pollution and climate change, it's surprising.
Again, because we don't see it, right?
Exactly.
Oh, my children have asthma. Well, I wonder why.
Yeah. And I think this is why the summit last week in San Francisco provided, I think, one beacon of shining hope, because you saw a huge demonstration amongst cities, local leaders, companies that you mentioned, saying that they want to stand by the Paris Agreement and take their own actions on climate change. And you were hugely influential in pushing forth their platform and this bottom-up action in the Paris Agreement and to really secure the broad support across many sectors to help get that through. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the key to making sure that all of these cities, states, regions, companies follow through on their commitments and it's not just another empty political statement and leads us back to right where we started?
The all-powerful factor of self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
You know, honestly, if anybody says, oh yeah, you know, we're going to do this because we're going to save the planet. Well, A, you ain't going to save the planet on your own. And B, I don't believe you. I don't believe it. Now, if somebody tells me, if a city like Paris says, I'm going to ban the electric cars, I'm going to ban the internal combustion engine, I'm going to make the center of the city car-free, I'm going to, all the wonderful things that Mayor Hidalgo is doing. Because I want clean air, now I believe you. Right? And now I know that you're really going to fight for it. Because it's something that affects you. It affects, if you're a mayor, it affects, the people of your city, if you're a corporation, and says, I'm actually going to turn this into a responsible company because I want business continuity. I want my business to be alive 50 years from now. Now I believe you. Right? We're still human, and until we turn into our spiritual selves, which we're also on a path, we have to be motivated for the time being by enlightened self-interest. And if enlightened self-interest means that you are improving the conditions of life, the quality of life for yourself, plus your family, your children, your citizens, now there is power behind that, right? Mm-hmm. That is what we should all be doing. We should be looking at improving the quality of life right now. It will also improve the quality of life 200 years from now. But it's about right now that you can't delay the decision for 200 years. It has to be right now. So I also believe in contextual messaging. Mm-hmm. So I don't talk to the health sector the same way that I talk to, the forestry sector, right? Because you have to contextualize the message. You have to see, what is that person interested in? And speak to that person from their own interests. Speak to them. And, nobody has to have climate change tattooed on their forehead. Even I don't. I have a different tattoo, but, it's not climate change.
I have CO2 right here.
You do? Show me. You don't have to have climate change tattooed, on your forehead. You always search for what is important to that person. What is going to motivate that person to actually take the difficult decisions that need to be taken? And in as much as you're able to do that, to the investors, you speak to them about stranded asset risk, yes. Right? Yep. To the health sector, you speak to them about 9 out of 10 people on the earth still, breathing polluted air, etc. So you have to understand what is important to them and awaken that interest, awaken that commitment, awaken the passion. If you can figure out what the passion is behind that person, now you have an unstoppable force, right? Now you have an unstoppable force. But you have to figure that out. And that's why I frankly don't believe in, an environmental police. Because nobody has created it for whatever reasons. Maria Ivanova will know why.
We have the expert on that.
She's the expert on that. But how do you police somebody to do something that they do not perceive that is in their interest? Very difficult, right? Unless they are as enlightened to know that it is in the public or in the common interest. But the force behind that is never as powerful as your enlightened self-interest. And that's why the Paris Agreement is based on enlightened self-interest of countries. So we did not go out, we learned a lot from the Kyoto Protocol, we learned a lot from Copenhagen, and we said, wow, the problem with the Kyoto Protocol is that we said, okay, right, we have to reduce by 5.2%, for all industrial countries. Now, we're going to parse it out. You take so much, you take so much, you take so much. Well, first of all, they all ran out of the room first, and we had to, bring them back in, lock the door. But in addition to that, it wasn't what they had chosen to do. Whereas for the Paris Agreement, we said, right, guys, you have 1 year, go home, do your homework. Here's the homework. Go talk to all your sectors, go talk to all sectors of the economy, go talk to everyone, and come back and tell us what can you contribute to this global solution that makes sense for you domestically. A very different proposition, enlightened self-interest. Right. So frankly, other than the United States, that still has a question mark, I'm just trying to think, which country is not on track to achieve its Paris commitments? I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any country that is not on track or in fact has already overachieved what they said they were going to do in Paris. Again, not because they want to save the planet. I would love everybody to be motivated by saving the planet. We're not. Everybody's doing it because it is for their own self-interest. And fortunately, because humanity is so fantastic and because the universe is so wise, these two things coincide. If we had to today choose between our enlightened self-interest and planetary health, guess which one would win? The fun thing is, and the wise thing, superior wisdom, that both of those coincide. So you have the moral imperative, you have the economic imperative, you have the technical imperative, you have the political imperative, sometimes questioned by some houses. But all of these are aligned, and all of them reinforce each other. Thank heavens. And therefore, you have the capacity, or you have the ability to align all of these forces all the way up and down the levels of system and be able to go on the exponential path. If you couldn't align everything at all levels of the system, you can't go across the exponential path. It's the alignment of the imperatives that allows you to do that.
And I think that's exactly what we saw, all the forces aligning together to make the Paris Agreement happen. But then you look at the analysis that shows that when we add up all of the commitments that countries have put forth in their Paris pledges, we're on track to a 3-degree warming world by 2100. So there's, again, this gap between the pledges and the actual ambition. And you mentioned ambition, and I think one of the major driving forces behind the summit last week is these non-state and subnational actors are wanting to help fill in the gap and increase the overall ambition to help us get closer to that goal. So what do you think is the secret sauce?
But Angel,
to really
I think it's
making it
really
happen?
important to understand what I tried to explain in the beginning. I don't run half marathons anymore, but I used to. And if anybody had told me at mile 3, well, you haven't finished the half marathon, I would have said, of course not, because I'm on mile 3. What part of that do you not understand? Right. Okay? The destination is clear. Yes, I am committed to fulfill my half marathon. And yes, I have to run the first 3 miles and the 5 and the 10 in order to get there. So that's the way we have to understand the Paris Agreement, right? The Paris Agreement is not a static agreement. It is an agreement that will stand the test of time, no matter what happens in politics. It will stand the test of time for several decades. And it is meant to be the 5-yearly collection of ever-increasing ambitions of country. So in 2020, we will come back again, and we will say, right, what did you do about your first 5 miles? How have you done? Okay, right. So now you've run your 5 miles. Now can we do, to 10 miles? Because ultimately, we have to be at zero net by 2050. So to judge the Paris Agreement on the first tranche is to judge an academic career by the first course that you took as an undergraduate. Well, that does not really determine whether you're, I mean, we have to understand that this is a build-up process. That's the way it was designed. That's the way it's being executed.
Right. And a clear way to help us get to those goals is finance. And you mentioned that in your remarks, and also you've written about the need for finance from both the private sector and also governments coming through and pledging and meeting their commitments towards the Green Climate Fund. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what the Green Climate Fund looks like in terms of its governance or its future, given the U.S.'s rollback on the Paris Agreement and also its financial pledges.
Yeah, the Green Climate Fund is a very sad story, but was a predictable story, because the Green Climate Fund was created to be the vehicle for part, not all, for part of the support that developed countries were going to give developing countries. It was never created to funnel the 100 billion that were promised. I think that needs to be clear. It was always very clear that it would funnel part of the public funding, not even all of the public funding, and certainly none of the private The FDI, the direct investment, foreign direct investment, was never part of the GCF. So anyway, it was always created to funnel a very, very small part. So it's sort of the tail that wags the dog. Politically, very important, because part of the deal that was struck in Paris to get all developing countries, in fact, all countries together onto this path, a differentiated path, but nonetheless a single path, was to say, right, we developed countries, we acknowledge that we have historical responsibility. Mm-hmm. That is not myth, that is not ideology, that is mathematics. Mm-hmm. Right? Yes, the developed countries have much more historic, in fact, have all the historic responsibility. And it's not a but, comma, and all countries have future responsibility. But in order to accept that as the fundamental logic upon which we built the Paris Agreement, some countries have all the historic responsibility and all countries have future responsibility. That logic was carved on the understanding that accepting that historic responsibility that some countries wanted to shirk would be represented symbolically by these 100 billion. That's what that represents. So it's not about the 100 billion, because we already know that we need $1 trillion invested every year, not 100 billion. 100 billion is peanuts, okay? Or, would you throw away from the peanuts? But it is politically very important because it was the understanding that was struck in Paris. So for the United States to say, right, in that understanding, we commit to 3 billion and we deliver 1, and then the other 2 come in, dark house occupants, and they say, we're not going to deliver those 2 billion. What? Hello? 2 puny billion you're not going to deliver? So that is the issue, right? Because it's not about the 2 billion. It is about turning your back on an understanding that was reached after 6 years of carefully calibrating every single piece of the puzzle. Right. And that was a very, very carefully crafted part. So understandable. And that, Angel, thank you for asking about this. That is the reason why China and India are being obstreperous, right? Yeah. It's not because the United States is not reducing their emissions, because they are. That's not about it. It's about because politically they have moved away from, not because they could perfectly well have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, but put in those 2 billion. And then we would have a very different political situation. Right. It's about those 2 billion. That's what's causing this mess. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't your question. What was your question, Angel?
But I think that was a totally fine response. It was, so in the future, do you think that now countries will follow the United States' footsteps and abandon the Green Climate Fund and seek more private sector infusion of financing? Or, what does the future of the GCF look like?
Well, I haven't seen any country abandon the Paris Agreement, have you?
No, but the GCF, sorry, their commitments to the GCF.
No, everybody else is putting their money in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the fun thing about this, right? So when Trump stood up there in the Rose Garden to make his announcement, poor roses, nobody followed that, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody. In fact, 24 hours before his announcement, because everybody already knew what he was going to announce, China and the European Union, 24 hours, not after, before, 24 hours before, China and the European Union came out and said, no matter what those roses are subjected to, we are sticking to our Paris Agreement. The Chinese representative just said it again last week. We are sticking by our Paris Agreement. They've actually already overcomplied. It's good for their economy, right? It's good for their economy. So that's what I call the bifurcated reality, right? They're all doing it on the ground. The international political situation is very complex because of $2 puny billion. But it doesn't have anything to do with investment on the ground, right? We are, as I said, I gave you the numbers for green bonds. Green financing is on the up curve, whether it is through green bonds or whether it is through direct investment into companies. We are going more and more and more into that investment. In fact, look at the other side, divestment, right? So divestment 10 years ago, nobody even knew what the heck that was, right? Today, we're at $6 trillion of financial money from most of the institutional investors that have actually said, right, we're divesting. Today, you have already the World Bank saying we're not going to fund coal. You have all of the development banks coming out saying they're not going to fund coal. The World Bank has just come out and saying we're not going to fund oil and gas. Now the other developing countries are going like, oil and gas, okay, now let's see what we have a growing number of private financial institutions, banks saying we're not going to finance it. You have insurance companies that are saying, you know what, we're not going to insure coal plants anymore. Too risky. They're not worried about the planet. They're worried about the value of their asset. And they know that those assets are increasingly stranded. So you have insurance companies that are saying, we're not going to give insurance policy. You have institutional, financial institutions that are saying, we're not going to finance. It has nothing to do with the GCF. Okay, there's another example of the bifurcated reality, right? The GCF is the political nightmare. These institutions that really hold the money, this is the real economy. So the real economy is moving forward. What gets the news is the political nightmare, as usual.
And I think that's really encouraging, especially when the oil and gas climate initiative was announced. I think there was a healthy dose of skepticism. Are these oil companies actually really committed to acting on climate change, or is it just another simple greenwashing, or they're doing it for PR? But it sounds like what you're saying is the momentum has shifted, where they're seeing it in their self-interest to act on climate change.
Totally.
So my question is, how do we get the other actors who are not acting on board? Because it's 13 oil and gas companies, and there's still many other heavy industrial sectors, many energy and other types of fossil fuel companies that are not yet acting and not on board. So how do we get them on board?
Yeah, interestingly, those 13, I'm probably going to get my numbers wrong, but they add up to about 80% of the oil and gas sector of the world. So, you know, it's not inconsequential. Right. Now, they're not all, you know, of the same stripes. There are some much, much farther ahead. All the Europeans are much farther ahead. So, you know, Total, Shell, Eni, BP, and I'm missing one European. Somebody help me, which is the fifth European? Sorry? Oh, thank heavens. Yay, Equinor.
You get an A.
Even changed its name. How cool is that, right? So what used to be called Statoil has now changed its name because they don't want oil in their title. How cool is that? So those 5 Europeans are way, way ahead of all the rest, right? Way ahead even of the other members of the OGCI. Way over here, you know, on the other extreme is now the new entrants that will officially join on Tuesday in New York. But they have all pre-approved, even Exxon and Chevron, they have pre-approved the amazing announcement that is going to come out of all of them on Tuesday. They are all committing to emission reductions from methane.
Wow.
That goes beyond anything that they have ever done, and I'm not at liberty to give you the numbers, but look at the numbers when they come out on Tuesday, because it is amazing, okay? It is amazing. Now, again, are they doing it to save the planet? No. Because if you allow methane to leak, that's actually, you know, reducing your product to your customer.
Right.
So there is a very interesting feedback that by investing in the reduction of methane leakage, that you're actually increasing the product that you sell. Now, about 50% of emission leakage reductions has actually negative costs because of that, and the other 50 actually has positive costs.
Right.
So they kind of balance each other out. The good thing, however, is that they are, by taking a public commitment to reducing their methane emissions, they are already taking a public stand, that they would not have done 3 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
So things are moving.
I think that's huge. I want to shift gears a little bit because it's also the women in innovation and entrepreneurship that helped to sponsor this event, and ask you about your experiences being a woman in a leadership role and negotiating, forging all these partnerships. And also,
Angel, I love that question, because here's my problem with answering that question. I've never been a man.
Yeah,
So-
I said the same thing. I said the exact same thing. When the students
Right.
asked me to bring it up, I said, I get that question all the time too. And how
So-
do you answer?
So can you help me? Because it's very, so what is it like to be a woman? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's just what I do.
That's exactly.
So how do we answer, Angel? Honestly,
Yeah.
how do you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's always really awkward, and so I was hoping I could take a beat from you.
Okay, anybody want to volunteer an answer on that one?
But I mean, we could look at, for example, coming out of the COP last year in Bonn, there was this gender action plan now as part of the convention to strategically try to increase the representation of women at all levels of the convention. So I guess that's one concrete way. But I mean, in your experience, I mean, how much of an issue, how important is it to have balanced gender representation in these dialogues and in these policy negotiations where women are traditionally underrepresented?
Well, I could give all kinds of answers to that. But my cheeky answer is, if you have the capacity to deploy 100% of your potential, how is it in your interest to only deploy 50% of your potential? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's the piece that I do not understand. It is not in anyone's interest to only deploy the 50% of population that happen to be male. What about the other 50% of the potential, of the human potential? It's in nobody's interest. Right. It's not in the interest of the global economy. It's not in the interest of the women themselves, their children. It's in nobody's interest. So that's the first piece that we have to understand, that we're actually depriving ourselves of an incredible potential that is latent, that needs to be educated, that needs to be given access, but that can substantially contribute to our political, economic, social, et cetera, evolution. So that's the first piece. The other piece is that the climate negotiations, like every other sector, or maybe not every sector, but most other sectors, are pathetically underpopulated by women, pathetically. Mm-hmm. And even so, there are more women during the 6 years that I was there, because, you know, I'm usually sitting up and I can see the ocean of people in front of me. Even during those 6 years, I saw more and more women coming in. And because I spend a lot of time outside of those negotiations, I always look back in my mind's eye to the negotiation hall and went, wow, there are more women there than there are in other sectors. Mm-hmm. So it's all relative, right? It's all relative. I do think, however, that there are certain characteristics that are more prevalent in female leadership than in male leadership. And the wonderful thing about that is that it is the complementarity of those two types of leadership that is so powerful. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons, in addition to starting, you know, this, and it actually goes back. I mean, the action plan now is like, I think, into its version number 4 or 5 or 6, that we started a long time ago about really reaching out and having every national delegation have at least one woman, one young person. That was, you know, our double request. Please, at least one woman. Please, at least one young person on every national delegation. That didn't always happen, but we always pressed them. You know, it's like, okay, well, I see the list. Where is the woman and where's the young person? Mm-hmm. Because you just have to fight against that, right? There is a default that goes toward adult males. And it's not a default of the year 2018. It's a default of thousands of years. So we're pushing against that default, which is in nobody's interest.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, especially because if we look at a lot of the research evaluating the impacts of climate change, they disproportionately burden women and children, and to have those perspectives in these official policymaking processes, I think only benefits everybody. So yeah, I mean, it's just nice to hear from the trenches and in your perspective of that change, even in a relatively short time, of increased participation from women. I think that's very promising.
And it continues, right? I mean, the women constituency that was created, I think, 8 or 9 years ago, there are 9 constituencies, which are everyone except federal governments, 9 constituencies that come always to the negotiations and are represented there. And they're just extraordinary women, you know, really on there, you know, really holding everybody to account, including me, which I always very much appreciated, you know, like, okay, well, you know, we decided this, like, where is it? So, you know, it has to be done.
Okay, I'd like to open up to audience questions. We have about 20 minutes left. So if you have a question, we have some audience mic runners, and then we'll collect 3 questions at a time. So, and remember, keep it brief, and I'm not afraid to cut you off if I feel like you're going off on a tangent. So, yes, in the back, Amanda?
Do you want to call?
Oh, you can go ahead. You guys can choose. Yeah.
The power of the mic.
Yeah.
Mary Evelyn Tucker, thank you so much for this wonderful dialogue and for all your work, Christiana. You've said enlightened self-interest is important, and we get that message, and you put it beautifully, along with the finance and technology and so on. You have also been a wonderful spokesperson for the voices of the religions and a spiritual and moral force. So that's my question, just to draw you out on that, and thank you for your leadership along those lines, too.
Okay, can we take 2 more questions? Maybe, gentleman in the back, or, sorry, yeah.
Thank you. We see that even in the fast-growing economies of India and China, there appears to be disconnect between research and science and the policy decision-making. I'm just requesting, what is your message to the budding researchers who will be future practitioners to bridge this gap? Thank you.
Okay, and up here?
Not sure if I'm going to lead you into a punchline here or a thought experiment, but you were talking about...
That's an interesting start to a conversation.
You were talking about the tattoo on your forehead, or in other words, framing using different people's passions when you're talking about climate change. What tattoo on your forehead has no one tried with Trump that you think might be interesting to try?
Those are 3 questions. Let me start with that, because in the beginning, I thought that it would be worth some collective effort, but from what I have seen, I have sort of put him into the category of, we will tolerate this for the time being. We will extract from it all the good that comes with it. And I think the reactions that we have had from women around the world, from the energy sector around the world, from cities and states around the world, who have actually stood up to say, that's not what we represent, that's not what we want, has been extraordinary. And sometimes we get a little bit too comfortable in our virtuousness or virtuosity, whatever, and say like, oh, you know, we're doing a good da-da-da-da. And you don't give yourself a kick. And I think that that is the effect that he's had on all of the good work that is happening. He has given us all a reason to stand up even more and to work even harder. And for that, I'm writing him a thank you letter. On India, you know, I don't think India is the only country that that has also internally a bifurcated reality, because of course there are many vested interests also in India. You know, a country the size of India, largest democracy in the world. And so I'm not surprised that there are all of these different conversations, with some wanting to go in this direction, others wanting to go in that direction. But from my perspective, and admittedly a far away, distant perspective, I see a convergence, an increasing convergence between science, whether it is on health issues, on climate, coming together with increasing policy coherence for the good of India. Let us remember that it is not the responsibility of India, large as it is, it's not India's responsibility to solve climate change. It is India's responsibility to do a good job for its citizens. And alleviation of poverty is number one. And so in that sense, when there is an overlap between alleviation of poverty and all of the other measures that we're interested in from a climate perspective, those are the ones that move forward. And that's why that's the sweet spot, right? And that's why I think it is so important to look for those sweet spots and to not have the tattoo across your forehead, because that's not necessarily going to move everyone. And I think, honestly, that that Modi has done an incredible job in trying in a country that is so checkered in its jurisdictional authorities, right? So many different jurisdictional authorities, and in a country like that, to set a target, and for him to come out and say, you know, by 2030 we will not be allowing any more vehicles that are not electric. I mean, that is just amazing. It is astonishing. One step up on China. So now China is going like, what? Well, we better set a date too. Right? Because there's always this play between those two countries, and India is actually taking a fantastic forward-leaning role right now. So pretty impressive there. On the spiritual, could I say there's two parts to that. One is my personal, that in the lead up to Paris, I was hit, because the universe has ways of doing that. I was hit by the deepest personal trauma that I have ever had. And I had to resort to spirituality in order to survive, and literally in order to survive, and in order to continue doing my work. So I had my invitation to find my inner self during that time. It was a pretty abrupt invitation, but nonetheless, I took it as an invitation. So that was my personal. But also, when I arrived at the Secretariat and I realized that the spiritual communities were over here and science was over here, and there was no conversation, and in fact, there was an underlying tension between the two. And it was immediately evident to me that that tension was not helpful whatsoever. And so there was a lot of work done in the beginning that then was very fruitful, of reaching out very, very intentionally to all spiritual communities, to all faiths, all of whom have the joint commitment of doing the right thing by creation, if you believe in creation. And the science community, that, if you put different words to it, are also working toward the same goal. So it was evident to me that they were both working toward the same goal, just using different language and working in different spaces, and that they would both be benefited by working together toward that goal. So those two were very intentionally brought together. And I must say, the support that the spiritual communities gave to the Paris Agreement was unequaled in anything that the United Nations has ever seen. Nothing. No other previous process of the United Nations was so deliberately, intentionally, passionately, and deeply supported by the religious communities. And I don't think we would have done it without it. I also don't think we would have done it without the support of the financial community, or the scientists, or the technical people. It's about bringing everybody together without any exception. And the spiritual communities could just not be an exception, in addition to the fact that they were very helpful to me personally.
Okay, more questions? Over here, I think we have majority of the questions.
Hi. Hi, thank you very much for coming. My name is Maggie Favretti. I'm a Yale alumna and an educator. I'm just wondering if you have given thought to what role education could and should be playing even beyond the Sustainable Development Goals.
And Maria?
Thank you. My name is Maria Ivanova. I'm also an alumna of this school. I was inspired here to study institutions, how they function and malfunction. And I have monitored the change of the UNFCCC during your time there, during your 6 years there, Christiana. And there was a dramatic shift in the institution that is the Secretariat of the Convention. And so I've come to be fascinated by the role of individuals in institutions. Could you please share with us, how were you as an individual able to shift the corporate culture of the institution?
Okay, one more
Well,
question.
do we have 3 years for that conversation?
Yes, Peter in the back.
Great. Peter Boyd, Christian, I love your last piece, sort of call to action for the people in the room saying, choose who you work for well on graduation. I was wondering if you thought, I meet quite a lot of startups here at Yale, and do you see any gaps in the corporate community where you say, if they didn't want to work for a good company, where would you love startups to start making things happen?
Yeah, and that's why, if I can just start at that one, because that's why I said work for or with, right? Because it's not necessarily a given that you will be an employee. I'm hoping that you will all explore your own possibilities. Now, Peter, that's a very difficult question, because there is a statistic out there that I am completely awed by, and that is 60% of the jobs that you all will have in your lifetime haven't even been invented yet. And that is so cool, right? That is so cool. But then my answer to your question is in those 60, right? Because the fact is, and this actually, if I can bring in the education piece there, the fact is that we all have to realize that no matter what sector we're in, no matter what human endeavor you're passionate about and want to turn your talent to, every single human endeavor is either directly or indirectly affected by climate change. Everything. And so I think the challenge that you all have is to realize that the context in which you are now training academically and the context in which you will work your professional life is a very, very different context to the context that we worked in. Fantastically, however, I think that there are so many new opportunities that will be opened to you. And if I were your age, if I were, now doing a master's or a PhD, I would be always looking for what is not there. I would not be looking for what is there, because A, how boring, and anyway, it probably hasn't contributed to the solution enough. I would always be exploring the delta between, I see that this is a solution, this is over here, what's in the middle? Or this is a problem that I have identified, all of these solutions don't seem to hit it, that's where I'm going to go. So to train your mind to look for what is not there rather than what is there, that I think is the exciting adventure that anybody who has a startup, because if you have a startup, it's because you've identified something that is not there, something that a piece of the puzzle that you want to put in. But there should not be only startups that do it. Even if you're going to go into employment in a company, you should be looking for what is not there. What is not there in corporate culture, what is not there in terms of environmental, social, or governance responsibility, and apply your skills and your talent to bringing that in. Assuming that those who have gone before you have done a good job and they've done their best possible, but certainly not completed the job. And there's always space for improvement. I am particularly excited about two things. I'm particularly excited about what technology can do, all the new technologies can do to decarbonize and increase resilience, by the way, a huge other chapter. I'm also particularly excited about the whole financial sector. Another sector, in addition to transportation, another sector that I think is just poised for a huge transformation. And so if you bring those two together, I think that combination is very exciting. But the answer to your question, Peter, is I don't know, because that's the whole point. The whole point is we can't see it right now. So what is the delta, and that is and that's the exciting part. And on education, I think it's a derivative from that. To really imbue everyone with the acknowledgement that we're now in a very different context that has huge responsibilities and many negative consequences, only a few of which we have felt. We will be feeling many, many more negative consequences over the next few decades. And at the same time, opens up many possibilities that we have never seen before. So a very, I guess, in the Chinese wisdom that every emergency or every catastrophe opens up this space for opportunities, and that's exactly where we are right now. And so not to train young people to, just follow the path that has been opened because, as I said, it's so boring, but to really be open for the creation, the co-creation. And the co is just as important as the creation, right? The co is just as important because we have reached such planetary boundaries by now that there is no such thing as a zero-sum game in the sense that we have understood it before. This, mentality of I win and therefore you lose, or you win and therefore I lose, that gone, out the door. We have to put ourselves, in addition into the exponential mentality and mindset, into the mindset of it is a zero-sum game. Either we're all at zero or we're all winning. We all lose together or we all win together. So the collaboration piece is now more important than ever. I call it radical collaboration because it is collaboration across all sectors, all geographies, all levels of the system. It is innately collaborative, which is not something that I was taught. I come out of a tradition that is highly individualistic, maybe served its purpose last century, completely useless this century. So, I would focus education on those two things, the change context and the opportunities that are there, but supported by this radical collaboration. And Maria, to your question, well, it takes, a book the size of yours to answer that question. But how could I crystallize it? Corporate culture. Let me crystallize it like this. Putting the person, the human being, at the center of everything. In full respect and in full honor of that person. So we moved from a corporate culture of seeing 500 people, all brilliant climate change people in all different areas. And I was very appreciative of their brains, but I was even more appreciative and honored by their full presence as human beings. Very different approach. Same thing with the way that we interacted with countries. Yes, I understand, that they all have their political positions, but what is the underlying interest? And where is the humanity, the true, deep humanity that binds people for a common purpose? Because, yes, I expect all 194 countries to come with very different positions. In fact, if there's one issue, and by the way, the Paris Agreement was negotiated on 167 different topics. And so to get, 194 positions to 167 different topics, well, kind of complicated. But through all of that was the invitation for everyone to rise to their highest purpose and to understand that, yes, we have many things that divide us, many things where we're different. Let's honor those differences and let us challenge ourselves to find the common ground, because that was the only way that we could move forward in full respect of the human being that is there, the full presence of that human being, but also in full respect of the differences that contributed to a very rich platform. So to see the diversity, if you will, not biodiversity, but human diversity or nation diversity as an incredible contribution and not as a burden to the process, and to be open to so many other voices, right? So to open to how to form a corporate culture that said, yes, we recognize, the UN, the boundary that the UN has established, i.e. the countries have established, is that this is an orchestration of national government voices, understood. But that doesn't mean that those national government voices cannot be informed by the voices of all of the other stakeholders. And so to open up that door, which was in the beginning very difficult because the national governments were like, well, excuse me, you're not supposed to be talking to the corporate sector. You're not supposed to be talking to the religious community. You're not supposed to be talking to it's about us. It's our national governments. Well, peu à peu, they understood that those are their stakeholders also. And so to have this much more open, inclusive, perhaps, attitude rather than exclusive, and a much more horizontal participation rather than a hierarchical participation, I think was very helpful, and led to what I call emergence of solution emergence, perhaps, emergence of solutions, so that we didn't know in the beginning how the Paris Agreement was going to end up, but we created the conditions. We fertilized the ground for everybody to listen to each other and for everybody to actually do deep listening. That's what Thich Nhat Hanh, my master, says, deep listening to each other. Truly it's not about hearing, no, it's about listening truly to what is the need there. And that allows for a very rich fertilization of a ground from which solutions and contributions and texts and ideas arise that you could never have thought. So to respect collective wisdom above individual wisdom, absolutely fundamental. Absolutely fundamental. And it was very clear that the complexity that we were dealing with could not be dealt with by a single person, by a single nation, by a single sector. It had to be the result of collective wisdom, intentionally fertilized and intentionally harvested.
Well, I wish we could continue all day, but you've been so generous with your time. So thank you so much for being an inspiration to all of us and to all the amazing work that you do. Please join me in thanking again Christiana Figueres. Thank you.